Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Students, today we are going to start our online session about
सर बस एक मिनट अभी आपका माइक ऑफ
मेरा
अनम्यूट करो माइक स्टार्ट
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we are going to start again our online session of A2 Economics. And today we are going to have a new chapter about the macroeconomy, chapter number 9. This is the second last chapter of your A2 syllabus. So as we started in our class, okay, it is not about micro but it is macroeconomics. It is about macroeconomic studies. Macro means large, as we all know. It is the study of macroeconomics means what? Macroeconomics. It deals with the study of economic variables at the national level. Economic variables at the national level. So previously we were talking about microeconomics, and microeconomics, that was the individual study of economic behavior of consumer and producer. Now collectively we will be talking about the national variables, like instead of studying income of the consumer, right now we will be studying the national income. And what are the different variables which will be studied in our macroeconomics topics? That is called, one of them is called national income growth. National income growth. And second topic, that is about full employment. That is about full employment. Or low unemployment. Stable price level or stable inflation, you can say. If prices are growing by a stable rate, there is no harm that prices are growing by 1 or 2%. They are helpful for the economic growth of the country. So these three economic variables, these are called the domestic economic variables of an economy. If they are performing well, we can say the domestic performance of the country is going good. National income growth tells us how many goods and services are produced in a given year, and they can be increased due to increase in aggregate demand in the country. When aggregate demand is growing, during the short run we can say there is going to be the actual economic growth which is taking place. So actual economic growth, that is about the demand side growth of the macroeconomy. And it is possible that whenever we find that increase in employment opportunities in the country, more people are getting employed, then there will be more economic growth in the country. Or due to fall in unemployment in the country, we will be having more of the economic growth which is taking place. And stable inflation means the aggregate demand, although it is growing, but the increase in aggregate supply is greater than the increase in aggregate demand. So prices are not increasing by a faster rate in the country. So if we want to see the domestic performance of the country, we have to look at these economic variables, which are the national income growth rate and unemployment, how it is decreasing, and stable inflation rate in the country. They are telling us about the domestic performance of an economy or domestic performance of a political government. Now the two other economic variables which are studied, one of them is called balance of payment equilibrium. That whatever the external outlook of the country is showing, that can be having the performance of balance of payment. We all know what is meant by balance of payment. That is about the international receipts and payments of a country. There should be a balance between the international receipt and the payments of the country. If they are balanced out, we can say we are having the balance of payment equilibrium. That is about our balance of payment equilibrium. It shows us the external outlook of a country, how external performance is there by the economic actors of the country when they are importing the goods or they are going to export the goods, or whatever the investment is coming to the country from other parts of the world, or how many people are shifting their capital amount from Pakistan to other parts of the world. All these international transactions of a country, they can be represented by the balance of payment of a country account. So now the last one, which is the economic variable, that is called the exchange rate. We all know this is the value of foreign currency in terms of our local currency. So this exchange rate should be stable. We should have a stable exchange rate in our country. If our exchange rate is fluctuating, it means our performance of the country is not going to be good, because country is going to have more payments than its receipts. So when we talk about our economic variables, so there should be a stable exchange rate. So these two economic variables, one is called the balance of payment, another is called the exchange rate. They are showing us the external outlook of a country. The external variables of the country, they need to be addressed, that they should also be in a stable form. We should not be having a continuous increase in our balance of payment deficit. If country is showing us a continuous increase in balance of payment deficit, then it needs to borrow money in order to bridge the gap between its payments and receipts. So keep it in mind, balance of payment is very important economic outlook of the country as we talk about the external performance of the country, and because of its disturbances, we are having massive deficits of the balance of payment. They will affect many of the economic variables, like exchange rate can be depreciated, which will be resulting into domestic inflation as well, which is caused by the external factors. And it can have the increase in economic growth as well. Whenever we are finding more of the exchange rate depreciation, our exports will become competitive, and more if they are demanded, then economic growth will be taking place due to the increase in more external demand of our goods. So it depends upon the master level condition as well. What is the price elasticity of exports of our country, and what is the price elasticity of imports of our country. So all these things, they are going to be the part of the study of macroeconomics. When we talk about macroeconomics, we will be studying in these things. So now what is meant by economic growth and economic development? Economic growth and economic development. These are the two things which are present in any of the economy. Economic growth means increase in the number of goods and services which are produced by a country. So increase in number of goods and services which are produced by a country, that is called the economic growth. How much number of goods and services produced in this year and in the previous year? So there are two things. One is called economic growth and another is called economic growth rate. What is the difference between these two? Economic growth means the number of goods and services which are produced by a country in a given year. And rate means in which percentage they have grown up. So when we talk about economic growth rate, that is measured in terms of percentages, because every country's volume of economic growth is different. They are producing different level of goods and services in their respective economies. But we have to compare their rate of growth. Which country has performed better in terms of percentage of the number of goods and services they have been increased over the period of time. So economic growth means the increase in number of goods and services, whereas the economic growth rate, that is called, we measure the increase in number of goods and services in percentage. Because the growth rates, they are compared when we want to see the performance of a country. We have to look at the percentage growth rate of the country. How economy has performed over the period of time, that is measured over the period of time in terms of percentage, not in the volume. In volume, we can say the largest economy of the world is US economy, and the second largest is going to be Chinese economy. They are having the largest volumes of economic growth. But in percentage, how much is their rate of economic growth? That is we are talking about. The smaller economies, they are showing us more economic growth rate, but their volume is quite small. But the larger economies like US and Chinese economies, they are showing us less economic growth, but rate is less, but their volume of growth is quite high. These are two separate things. Keep it in mind, we measure economic growth rate in terms of percentage, how much a country has performed well. Now what about the economic development? Do you think when we have an economic growth rate in the country, is it going to improve the economic development as well? Economic development means improvement in the quality of life of the people living in the country. When their quality of life is increasing, previously it was assumed that when a country is showing us more economic growth rate, it will be having more better form of economic development as well, because they were measuring the quality of life by GDP growth rate over the population growth rate. When GDP growth rate is going to be faster than the population growth rate, then overall per capita or average income of the country was increasing, and when people are having more income earned, they can spend more on the quality of life as well. They will be spending on getting better education, they will be spending on getting better health facilities in the country. So if the quality of life is also increasing due to increase in the economic growth, we can say the improvement in quality of life, that is called economic development. Development cannot be only shown by the amount of income earned by the people in a country, but it can be shown by other variables like the spiritual betterment of the people through education. People are having good literacy rate in the country, they are having good health conditions, like average life expectancy of the people living in a country, that is improved over the period of time. Then we say economic development that is taking place, and we are having less poverty. What do you mean by poverty? People, those who are, the number of people in a country who are unable to afford the basic necessities of life, or how many number of people are able to earn less than $2 per day. So if the number of people in a country, they are less in number than those who are poor, we can say the country is showing us more economic development, that there is improvement in the quality of life, people are having good food, and their living standard is also improving if they are getting better education, health condition, their infrastructure like better roads, better sanitation facilities, they are having clean drinking water available, and their living conditions are not damp. They are having better living standards and better living conditions. Then we say a country along with economic growth, it is showing us economic development as well. But most of the time we see when country is showing economic growth, it is not showing us economic development. What is the reason behind? The reason is when we are having unequal distribution of income in the country, whatever the income or the number of goods they have grown up, they are not equally distributed in the country. We are having unequal distribution of the resources, and the whatever economic growth has been performed by a country, that wealth is concentrated in few hands. And the trickle down effects of that economic growth, they are not enjoyed by all the mass population. Wealth is concentrated in a few number of people, and when we talk about development, we should have improvement in the betterment of people's living standard, from the achievement of the basic needs towards spiritually and materially better lifestyle. That is the meaning of economic development. They should be materially good off, they should be materially good one, and they should be having spiritual better life in the country living. So we say that country is going to have economic development as well along with the economic growth. Okay. Now we are going to talk about the economic growth. What are the different types of economic growth which could be present in a country? Okay. Now I am going to talk about different types of economic growth and their importance to be studied in our lesson of macroeconomics. Like economic growth we have studied till now, that economic growth is the increase in the number of goods and services, whereas the economic development is the improvement in the living standard of the country. Okay. Now economic growth can be of two types. Mainly there are two types. One is called actual economic growth, and another is called what? Potential economic growth. When we talk about the short run and long run economic growth, we say the actual growth of the economy, that is about short run economic growth, whereas the potential economic growth we say that is the long run economic growth. How can we talk about actual economic growth? When the economic growth is taking place by utilizing the existing resources, when aggregate demand in the country that increases, so it will be utilizing the present resources which are available, which were previously unemployed. So when these resources they are employed by a country due to increase in aggregate demand, when producers are buying more capital equipments and they are hiring more labor to produce more goods and services, we say this type of economic growth is called short-run economic growth or actual economic growth which is taking place. Whereas the long-run economic growth or potential economic growth, that is about the increase in the productive capacity of the country, the increase in the number of resources which are growing over the period of time, that is called the potential economic growth or long-run economic growth. So actual growth, that's about the demand side growth, when aggregate demand in the country that is growing, and this is the full potential growth when the long run aggregate supply curve that is increasing, it is going towards right. So we say that economic growth rate which is increasing the productive capacity of the country, like resources they have increased in quantity and quality, then we say this is called long run economic growth or the potential economic growth. So actual growth rate, that is aggregate demand side growth, and this is called long run aggregate supply side growth, when supply is increasing in potential. If you remember our familiar topic of PPC, production possibility curve, in our AS level we studied in detail and many times we have studied it. Okay, so this is what the consumer goods, and on the horizontal side we are taking the capital goods. This is our traditional shape of production possibility curve which is bored outward, and it shows that opportunity cost of the two goods that will be increasing when we move from one side to another, because resources are limited and they have alternate uses. Now if economy is operating at point X below the PPC, it is not fully utilizing all its resources. What it is happening, it is not utilizing all of its resources at point X. So when aggregate demand in the country increases and economy moves towards point Y, now it is utilizing the present resources which are available. So this is called the actual economic growth which is taking place, because the existing resources they are being employed instead of increasing the potential of the country. So when economy moves from the point which is lying below PPC towards PPC, economy is going towards PPC, so it is using existing resources which are already present. Therefore actual economic growth is going to take place. So this is what I say, this is called the actual economic growth, which is actual economic growth which is taking place due to increase in aggregate demand in the country. We say we are having here the real GDP. If you remember in our AS level we studied about the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. This is the shape of long run aggregate supply curve, This is what long run aggregate supply curve, and this is aggregate demand. So when aggregate demand is increasing towards right, so the real GDP that is increasing without changing the price level according to Keynesian economic thought that aggregate supply curve is horizontal. So prices are not changing but real GDP is increasing. We say this is the actual economic growth which is taking place. So actual economic growth is taking place when we are utilizing the existing resources to produce more goods and services. Then we say there is going to be the actual economic growth, and this is aggregate demand side. And you know about the aggregate demand. Aggregate demand equals to what? C plus I plus G plus net exports. If any of these variables they are increasing, then aggregate demand will be shifting rightward. Like consumer expenditures, the consumption by the households that is increasing, they are expecting to have more consumption, so they are increasing the aggregate demand. Or investment in the country that is increasing, the producers they are buying more capital goods in order to produce more goods and services in future. Then again aggregate demand will shift rightward. And government spending on development projects, when government is spending on the development project which will create employment opportunities in the country, then definitely aggregate demand will increase. Net exports being the aggregate demand of our exports, they have grown up faster than the demand of our imported items. So in that case aggregate demand will grow rightward, and in that reason we are going to have more of actual economic growth which is taking place. So these are the reasons of actual economic growth which are going to have to increase the not the potential of the country but the present resources, they are better utilized than the previous level of utilization. Now what about the potential economic growth? Potential economic growth, how will it take place? Now I said earlier that this is the increase in the productive capacity of the country. The resources they are increased in quantity and quality. Their quantity of resources like labor force that has increased in number due to increase in the population size of the country, and at the same time we are going to have increase in the productive capacity, like new resources from the piece of land they have been explored, like new oil wells they have been explored, new gold mines they are explored in the country. So all these things they are going to increase the potential resources. Our country is spending more on the investment productivity of the country, like in future we will have better equipments to produce more goods. We are improving the infrastructure to have more potential of the country in future. So all these things they are going to increase the potential economic growth of the country. So when potential is increasing, what happens to our PPC? Remember we did in our AS level that PPC will shift outward. So when PPC shifts outward due to increase in the productive potential of the country, we say this is called the potential economic growth. So potential economic growth is taking place when resources they have increased in quantity and quality, and that is shown by the help of a diagram, an outward shift of the PPC. PPC is telling us the possibilities of production of two goods when all resources are fully employed. So when potential has increased, then PPC will be having a rightward shift. So this is called potential economic growth. Now it can be shown as well by using the long run aggregate supply. This is what the real GDP, again we know it, this is real GDP which is measured on horizontal axis. This is the price level. Now previously we were having this aggregate supply line and aggregate demand curve is lying at this place. So when long run aggregate supply curve that shifts rightward, so this is called the potential economic growth is taking place. Now demand, I haven't shifted demand in this case, but actual economic growth is here, but the productive capacity of the country that has increased. So So we talk about the actual economic growth, which is aggregate demand side growth. It is taking place during the short run when aggregate demand is increasing over the year, over the period of time. And this is the potential economic growth, which shows us the increase in productive capacity, and it will have a rightward shift of the PPC or rightward shift of long run aggregate supply curve. Now, let us talk about when both economic growth, both actual and potential, they are taking place simultaneously. So what happens in the diagrams? When both potential and economic growth, they are simultaneously happening in the country, how will they look like in our diagram? Both aggregate demand and aggregate supply, now they will be shifting towards right. Now see over here, this is the capital goods, this is consumer goods. I am writing K for the capital goods because both are starting from C. The letter C is in order to differentiate. I am using K for the capital goods. Now this is the PPC. So when actual economic growth is taking place from point X towards point Y, which is lying out of the PPC in this condition. So when we talk about the potential growth, now see over here, economy has grown from point X to point Y. Now this Y is again lying below the new PPC of the country because the productive capacity of the country has also increased. So here we say now actual growth is taking place along with the potential growth. How to show it? With the help of real GDP. This is what? Real GDP, and this is the price level. Now both the curves, they will be shifting rightward. This is long run aggregate supply one, and now we are having increase in the productive capacity and aggregate demand, although it was growing here, now it is growing above. So when we talk about this thing, now the actual growth is also increasing and potential growth is also increasing. We are showing it with the help of PPC and our familiar diagram of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So when long run aggregate supply increases, it shows us what the potential economic growth is taking place and aggregate demand is shifting rightward. So that is shown with the help of increase in aggregate demand. Now come towards the output gaps of the country. What are the output gaps? There can be two types of economic output gap. One is called positive gap and another is called negative gap. So when we talk about the positive gap, what do we mean by positive output gap? Do you know what is meant by trade cycle or business cycle of a country? That shows the movement of actual economic growth around the potential paths. When we said it shows the movement of actual economic growth around the potential path, potential economic growth. This is called the oscillation of the actual economic growth around the potential path. So here I am taking what? Time, and here I am taking GDP, which is the growth. So this is the trend paths or the potential path. This is called trend paths. You can see it has a constant slope, so it shows us the potential economic growth will be taking place with a constant rate, but actual is growing by this rate. This is the actual path. This is now actual GDP. So when actual GDP is lying above the potential. So this gap between this, we say this is point C and D. This gap is called what? Positive output gap. Positive output gap. Okay. This is positive output gap. When actual GDP is lying above the potential, it means aggregate demand will be higher and country will be having overheating in the form of high price level in the country. Inflation is taking place. And the gap between actual and potential, if it is below the potential line, then we say actual GDP is lying below the potential path or trend path, then we say this gap, you can say this gap AB is called what? Negative output gap. Negative output gap. So how to show it with the help of aggregate demand and supply? This is what real GDP, I am not writing the word real. This is long run aggregate supply, I am taking only the vertical part right now. This is aggregate demand and this is what? Aggregate supply. This is the short run. And when aggregate demand grows faster than the potential, then we say this is called the positive output gap. Now more goods are demanded than they could be supplied by the producer. This is called positive gap. This is called what? Positive gap. This is the full potential, but actually more goods are demanded than the full potential of the country. Then we say this is called positive output gap. And how to show the negative output gap? This is now long run aggregate supply. This is long run aggregate supply. Previously demand was here and supply was also here. This is short run aggregate supply. So when aggregate demand falls downward, now it is having, this is what? Now the full potential is higher, but actual economic growth rate, this is the actual now and this is potential. So you can say when actual is lying below the full potential, we say this is called the negative output gap. Negative output gap. Alright, that's all for today. We have studied different types of economic growth rate, actual growth, potential growth, and what is meant by positive economic growth and negative economic growth. That's all the lesson we have concluded today. And tomorrow I will be continuing from the same point with sustainable economic development, and then we will be moving towards the benefits of economic growth and then the cost of economic growth. I will be having a little bit faster study of online. So keep it in mind, be patient, and then show your performance by writing the assignment as well, which will be coming to you in this week as well. Thank you for today. That's all. Thank you very much. That's the lesson of today.